My name is Charles Gehring. I'm director of the new Netherland Research Center, which is part of the Office of Cultural Education. The center is on the 7th floor of the library, and you're welcome to visit it as soon as the museum and this building is open to the public again. We're in an exhibit that was put in recently. It's a temporary exhibit on Fort Orange, the Dutch fort that was built in 1624. It'll be part of the permanent exhibit that's being worked on as we speak. It'll be incorporated into an exhibit that'll feature Dutch heritage in the 17th century as it existed here in Beverwijk, Fort Orange on the upper Hudson. The Dutch were here mostly to trade for furs. They followed Hudson in 1609 and eventually built a fort on Castle Island in the Hudson River called Fort Nassau. But it was too close to the water and got washed away 3 years later in 1617. A number of years went by before they decided to build another fort after the formation of the Dutch West India Company, and that is Fort Orange, and that's where a lot of the artifacts were found back in the early 70s. There's a lot of information on the Dutch. The fur trade was very important. The furs had been more or less hunted out in Europe at that time, so the merchants who made hats, castor hats, usually made out of beaver fur, was coming out of Russia at that time. And when Hudson recorded in his log that there were a lot of furs in this area, the merchants in Amsterdam took note of that and decided to start sending people over here to negotiate with the Indians. The person who followed Hudson was a man by the name of Blok, Adriaan Courtse Blok. An island is named after him off the coast of Long Island, you might be aware of. He started the fur trade, collecting Zeeland or wampum along the coast of Connecticut and eastern Long Island. And he had this material, Zeeland, they're little tubes where the Indians would bore holes through. It comes off of the lip of a coho clam or a whelk clam, and they would string these, and the Indians in this area, the Mohawks and the Mohicans, prized these for decorative items and also to record important events in their history. So the trade started. The people up here couldn't produce the Zeeland, so they prized what Blok had aboard his ship, and they more or less said, we'll give you furs for this Zeeland. And it became a type of currency eventually, so that the Dutch could trade Zeeland for furs eventually, and they increased their profits along the way. The fur trade was the most important part of the Dutch settlement. Petrus Stuyvesant said, without Fort Orange, we might as well go back to Europe, because that's what the whole settlement here was about. Now, how do we know all of this? I've been translating 17,000 pages altogether of the administrative records of the Dutch colony here. And we've already published over 18 volumes of translations. These records are in the New York State Archives, as public papers. The documents that the library holds are considered private papers, but these are, in many cases, family papers in Dutch, and also a large quantity of documents from the patroonship of Rensselaerswijk. And they are also part of this building. This building houses more information about New Netherland above and below ground, documentary evidence, and material culture below ground than any other place in the world. I've been translating pages of administrative records of the colony of New Nederland, or New Netherland, since 1974, and they were in perfect condition until 1911, when the library caught fire at the west end of the capital. And these documents all went through a fire. They were found under a mound of papers and documents, manuscripts that had collapsed on top of them from higher shelves. And they were mostly English documents, actually. So the English documents actually saved the bulk of the Dutch records. These are a couple of the worst burned items that we have, but it's a problem of translation, of translating what isn't there anymore. So when we translate, we have to do a lot of background research to know exactly what the context is for that period of time in order to do a fairly decent translation. And in the footnotes, we'll tell how much has been left out or we don't know about. In 2009, we had the celebration and commemoration of the visit of Henry Hudson to this river that now carries his name. And during the celebration, the Dutch consulate in New York informed us that they were going to support a financial support for 4 years, including the establishment of a room in the library. They very strongly supported this venture, something that I had in mind for years, to put all of the books that we use for research, for translating the Dutch documents. They're now available in the Netherland Research Center, both primary and secondary sources. So once the room, or the library is open again, if you have an interest in this period of time, I encourage you to visit the room and read through what we have there. It's almost, I think it's close to 1,000 books already. We have a support organization called the New Netherland Institute. This is a 501c3 non-for-profit organization. They publicize what we do. They raise money for other activities such as student exchange, grants, and prizes for best manuscripts, both books and articles. And the Institute is also housed in this building. And you can actually become a member of the Institute, which I encourage. It will help us to continue to disseminate the translations and information about Dutch heritage in New York.
Hi, I'm Mike Lucas. I'm the Curator of Historical Archaeology here at the New York State Museum. And what I'm going to show you is some of the artifacts, just a few of the artifacts that we have that are related to New Netherland and from sites of New Netherland. So the first thing I want to say is we have thousands of artifacts from the New Netherland period, from the early 17th century, really through the end of the 17th century, from Albany and Manhattan mostly. Most of the artifacts, and some that I'm going to show you today, I'm going to basically show you things from Fort Orange, but we have sites throughout Albany that were part of large excavations for parking lots and things like parking garages and things like that, as well as Manhattan for some of the big digs that they had down there. So I'm just going to show you stuff from Fort Orange today, but we have a lot more artifacts. So Charlie talked about why the Dutch were here, and what I'm going to show you is not just some of the Dutch artifacts, but also some of the Native American artifacts, because as we know, where Fort Orange was, where we're standing right now, was Mohican land, was Mohican homeland. So we also found some of that material, or the archaeologists, when they were digging in the 1970s, found that kind of material as well. So this will kind of give you an idea of the types of material culture that people brought from Europe, why they brought that material culture from Europe, and give you a little bit of a glimpse of the types of things that you won't get from historical documentation. So why don't I go ahead and show you a few of the artifacts. First of all, as I said, when this was excavated in the 1970s by Dr. Paul Huey and his mostly crew of volunteers, they didn't really know what they would find, if they'd find anything left over from Fort Orange, because as we know, this is an urban environment, so people are always building buildings, so they'll build one building on top of another, and that has a tendency to destroy things. But in the process of this excavation, they found intact material from a number of different time periods. So what archaeologists are very interested in the layering of the soil, because if there was no construction like you see in a city, you would see layer after layer of soil, and that would represent different layers back in time. So the earliest material would be on the bottom, the latest material on the top. So in some places you'd have, in Albany, you'd have where they put in a sewer line, or they put in a water line or something, and that would cut through all these layers and destroy that material. But then in between these construction periods, sometimes you'd find layers that were still intact, that were laid down just as they were many hundreds and thousands of years ago. So in the process of doing this excavation, Dr. Huey found that there was one layer right at the bottom that had primarily Native American material, pottery, other types of artifacts, and to this time period when this was Mohican land. So some of the artifacts, and I'll show you a few here. This is, I have some pieces of pottery mostly. This is a piece of a pottery that has, that's handmade pottery, and it's got a surface on it from cordage. So that was used to flatten the surface to compact it so that the coils would seal together. So these are coiled vessels. And you can see on some of these, this one here, you can kind of see some of the, you might be able to see this. You can see this has got basically a flat surface, so there's no ridges or anything on this, so this was just a smooth paddle probably. And then you can see on the back side, if you can catch some of the sort of shiny bits in there, that kind of tells you what they use as a temper to make this pottery. It's very thinly potted. It's probably very late, late as in close to the time when when the Dutch came up and resettled the area. Here's another piece that this is part of a rim of a pottery vessel. And so later, and toward the time when the Dutch resettled this area, Native Americans were putting collars on pots, and so this is the very top of the rim, and you can see some designs on this. This is very common during this time period. An interesting thing about these collections is, you know, once you put them into cabinets, it's not like they just stay in those cabinets. We want to continue to research objects to tell more about a site. And one of the recently, excuse me, recently we got some carbon dates on some of the bones, some of the animal bones, mostly deer, from this this Native American settlement. And we were able to take small pieces, a very small piece of the bone, and get a carbon date from it. So by that we were able to, by the position in the ground, it was underneath a flood level that we think was 1618. So it looks like there were, and there were historic artifacts associated with that. And from the carbon date, it looks like there was possibly a little trading post there before Fort Orange. So that's very interesting and exciting, and that's why these collections are important to keep and curate and make available for future research. This also is a stone tool. It's see, it's got a mark back on there that tells us where it's from. So these artifacts are labeled. And this is this would have been attached to a shaft and was used as an arrow. You also find spear points, but this was an arrowhead. So this is very late, probably contemporaneous with that piece of pottery that I showed you. That's just a taste of some of the artifacts that we found, or that were found in this before Fort Orange period. So the layers that date to Fort Orange, there were various layers dating all the way back to the early 1624 when the fort was constructed, all the way through the 17th century after the fort was abandoned. So what I'm going to show you today is pretty much the artifacts from the fort itself when it was in operation. Dr. Gehring had talked about objects that were used in the fur trade, and a lot of those objects are in this collection. So I can show you a few of those things that were important. Excuse me. One trade item that was particularly important is this little object right here, which is a mouth harp, and it's probably made out of copper, this one, or some kind of copper alloy. And the tine is gone here, but this is a very old instrument. It started circulating in around Europe around the 12th century. So you see this fairly common from that time period on. This one has some little notches on it, some markings, but this was an important trade item from the beginning to trade. The Dutch were trading for furs with that, as well as something like this, which is it looks like a little marble or something, but it's actually a button. You can see back here, this is the metal part that's now has rusted, but this is where it would have attached to a piece of clothing. And these are sometimes called Cossack buttons, but they're actually buttons that were produced in Germany, as a lot of artifacts were, or a lot of objects were produced in Germany and then transported through the various waterways through Amsterdam. So you see a lot of German artifacts, and I'll show you that some of those later. But this was an important object that was specifically for the trade. You don't see a lot of these outside of trade sites. So you find these on, these are found on Haudenosaunee sites in the mid 17th century. Some other objects that might also be trade objects are knives or any kind of metal implement. So this is a knife. This is a 17th century knife, and of course it would add a handle, either bone or wooden handle. And you can see the blade here. This is what's left of it. The other thing I want to mention about these types of artifacts is they need to be conserved. Otherwise, they will continue to rust, and eventually there'll be a box or a bag full of dust. So they're treated with the salts are taken out of the object, and they're treated with a solution to stop that rust. So we'll have these for future generations. Okay. Another object that really is, and you may not be able to see this, is very small. It's this is a bead this is a glass bead, and beads were very important in the trade as well. Various colors of beads, red, black. This one is an off-white color. Hundreds and hundreds of beads were found at Fort Orange, and any of these trade sites of that time period would probably have beads as well. So it's a very small object, but a very important object. Another one I want to show you, well, I'll show you this. This is something that Dr. Gehring talked about, and I'm going to take it out. It's this is what Charlie was talking about is a piece of savant or wampum. This is a shell bead that was used in the fur trade. So this was found in Fort Orange. You can tell it's very small, and yes, it was used as currency by the Dutch, and then of course many other symbolic uses by Native Americans. So it's a very small piece. It's kind of rolling around a bit here, but very delicate piece of material culture. One other thing for this trade, pipes were also traded, and one of the this pipe right here is a traditional Dutch pipe that most of the people in New Netherland would have smoked tobacco out of something that looked like this during the 17th century. So this is a typical shape. Then in the mid 1640s, they start making pipes that look like this, and you can see the difference in the shape. This is more angular, and versus this bowl that kind of bulges out on either side. This is a type of pipe that was created specifically by a pipe maker named Edward Bird for the fur trade, for trade. And I want to show you an example of why they use this shape. This was a Haudenosaunee pipe, a Native American pipe from Jefferson County, New York, and you can see the shape there. And so the theory is that they were producing these pipes because they're similar shape, and that these were a valued or a desired object within the trade. So they start making these right around that time period, 1640s. Okay, so those are some of the trade objects. Now I want to move on to some other objects that we find. These are a little bit more, maybe a less exciting objects, but objects that were important as well. This is a Dutch yellow brick. It was produced in the Netherlands, and you find these on 17th century Dutch sites. This is a pretty common artifact that was used in brickwork for chimneys, and also sometimes in foundations. But this is a very, it's an interesting object because it's not something, usually when you find a brick, it's been produced in somewhere in North America, but this one is in fact straight from the Netherlands. So that was something that was imported. Here's another object that's, this is a thick, you can tell this is a red, this is probably also made in the Netherlands, but it's a red bodied piece. And you can see the glazing here. It's got a very thick glaze. It's a very thick piece. This might have been part of a hearth, some sort of flooring, probably a hearth because it's so thick. There's another piece here that's much thinner, and this one is, you can see it's got a green glaze on it. This was probably a floor tile. These were very common in Dutch households, so they would have large, like the tile would be maybe that big, and they would have a series of tiles, sometimes in different alternating colors. And so this was something that they brought over to remake the houses like they knew in Amsterdam. So you'll see the same type of material culture that you would see in Amsterdam at the same time. This is another architectural feature of houses. This is a roofing tile. So these roofing tiles would overlap, and they were very sturdy. They were very easy to put up. If one broke, you could just replace it with another one. They have this little hook on the bottom that would hook over a slat on the barn or on the house, and then you just put another one over top of it. So these were actually produced, especially up here. We have a brickmaker's house and brickyard from the mid-17th century. So they were making these kind of tiles here in New Netherland. So this is something that's local and not brought in. Then I want to move on finally to some of the everyday material culture that you would see, like I said, not just in the Netherlands, but also in New Netherland. So they were reproducing the same type of households that you would, household that they knew in the Netherlands, bringing the same type of material culture. I'll start out with this piece because it's really an interesting and beautiful piece. So this, you can see here, this is a cherub's head, and you can see the trumpet probably coming out here, and then the hand there, and then the hair. So this was probably a large charger or a large plate. This is something that not only is it beautiful to us today, obviously it was beautiful in the 17th century. These things were hung up as pieces of art. So sometimes, and this one doesn't show it, but almost always, you would see a hole in the back of this is the foot ring, and it'd have a hole through here, and they made them like that so you could actually hang it up from the wall. So you could hang it up like this, so you know when it wasn't in use, you could have it as a piece of art. So that's an interesting piece. It's something called Dutch Maiolica. They also produced, this is another piece of ceramic, and you can tell it looks very much like the Chinese style at the time. So they were trying to reproduce the look of the Chinese porcelains at that time. So this is, here again, mid-17th century. And this one has a full ring. I do not see the hole in this one. Usually they have one, but so this is another type of plate. It's called Wan Li, and this is very common on not just on Dutch sites in the New World, but also Dutch sites in the Netherlands. This is I'm showing you some really kind of interesting little pieces, but this is a stoneware, and you can see it's got a lion's head. This was probably produced in Germany, and it was probably a jug or a tankard or something. It's a very thin bodied stoneware, and these type of stonewares were very common during the late really early 17th century on through. So it's also a very common object that you're going to find. I'll show you one more ceramic, actually maybe two more. This one's kind of an interesting one. It's a bowl, but they would it's sometimes referred to as a Klapmuts bowl. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but because its shape was like a hat. So if you imagine the bowl coming around like this, it looks like this type of a hat called klapmuts. And if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, I'm sorry. But so that's how they refer to these type of bowls. So, but also a very attractive type of something you're going to find in pretty much every household. Then some other objects are less common, and certainly you probably wouldn't find this in the well, you might find it in the Netherlands, but you find it over here on New Netherlands sites, in particular here at Fort Orange. This is a pipe stem, so you can see the hole in the stem. So you know the pipe would have been probably that long, and then you can see another hole right here. And what this was, if you can imagine it was this long. So your pipe breaks. You know you can't really do anything with a pipe stem. They made it into a whistle. So that's what this hole is. It's for taking a former piece of material culture used for tobacco smoking and turning it into a whimsical, whistle. So that's kind of an interesting object, and we find a lot of those. Also, these you also find on Dutch sites, you find a lot of marbles, I didn't know until I actually came up here from Maryland that knickerbocker was a term for the marble makers. So you find lots of marbles in 17th century Dutch sites. You don't find those in the English sites from that time period as much. This is really quite common in these sites, so it's not surprising to find one at Fort Orange, and there were many actually found there. Another object that's that you find on New Netherlands sites are Romer glasses. So these were this is just a small fragment of a cup that this is called a prunt, and these prunts would have been around the stem. So it had a wide stem, and you'd hold on to that stem, and these prunts would kind of give you a surface to hold on to the cup. So the cup would have been, say, this big, and then these prunts would have helped you hold on to it, but they also add a nice decorative aspect to the cup. But you can see how thin the glass is, and these things were used all the time. They must have been very quite cheap. They're produced in Germany. They look very delicate to be on the frontier, but these show up from the beginning. They love their Romer glasses. I think I'll show you maybe one more thing to round it off here. This is this is another type of thing that you might find on these sites. This is the design hasn't changed much in 300, 400, 500 years. This is a thimble. So this is a 17th century thimble that was found at Fort Orange. And sometimes you also find pins. They sometimes don't survive in the record, but this is an example of some type of household object that you might also find. So that pretty much wraps it up for me. Hopefully that gives you a good, at least a thumbnail sketch of what you might find on these New Netherlands sites.
Good morning, Manny. My name's Jennifer Lemak. I'm the Chief Curator of History here at the New York State Museum. And you just heard from Charlie Gehring and Mike Lucas, so I thought I would share some of the Dutch-related artifacts here in the history collections. We are currently standing in one of our largest history collections spaces, which is a rare treat. So our Dutch collections can be broken down into three different categories. The collection you see here on the table was acquired from a kind of well-known collector from Staten Island. His name was George Way. And we specifically acquired these collections here, the Delftware, the stoneware, the Delft plate, because these are some of the items that the Historic Archaeology collection has, but insured. so we can offer the full complete artifact. So a lot of the things that are in some of the digs done by historic archaeology, a lot of times when they're digging up a colonial Dutch site, they'll find these little raspberries. And these are this is a Dutch Romer glass. And they'll find the raspberries in both the clear and the green. And I believe there's some down in the Fort Orange exhibit. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the full piece looks like. Other things that are found in historic archaeology are the Delft pieces. In the 17th century, Delft was shipped all over the world, including tiles, plates, many of them with Asian motifs, since Chinese export porcelain was hard to get in certain decades of the 17th century. So the folks in Delft started to recreate Chinese export porcelain. We have a nice little inkwell, or I'm sorry, this is a tea caddy and an inkwell with nice little Dutch flowers on it, and then a little cup. And the quintessential item from Delft is that we see here in New York State are Delft tiles. And these would be kind of inset around a fireplace. And we chose these because they have children playing games on each of them. Other items that archaeologists find are different pieces of stoneware and ceramics. And we have 17th century Dutch genre paintings that show some of these items in use that we also acquired from the George Way collection. And I pulled a few of them. Several of these are tavern scenes, which show the jugs being used and the stoneware cups and bowls being used. So these are a nice collection of Dutch people kind of using their everyday items, and we're able to see how they lived through these paintings. Let's see. Other items that we have, I'm going to guess that Mike Lucas and Charlie Gehring talked about tobacco. Tobacco was widely used by the Dutch, and here we have a little brass tobacco box with a nice little design on it, which is upside down. And then in almost all Dutch 17th century genre paintings, you see the Dutch smoking pipes. And this is a pipe rack. And often the archaeologists find little pieces of pipe in the digs. Other items in our collection are, this is a waffle iron. The Dutch brought waffles to the New World, or to New York, what was now New York. And then this is a wafer iron. And if anybody is interested in colonial Dutch foodways, they should check out Peter Rose's books. She is an expert on colonial Dutch cooking and foodways, and her books are widely available. A couple other items we've pulled here are 2 foot warmers. These are from the Netherlands. This one is all brass, and this one is wood and with a brass handle. It's very rare that the handle is still intact with the foot warmer, but these foot warmers, especially this one, are often seen in a lot of Jan Vermeer paintings of the era. So another artifact from the George Way collection is this Bible box, and Bibles were incredibly important to the Dutch. They would record births, deaths, and marriages on the front and back pages of the Bible, and then the Bible would go into a box like this, or if you were wealthy, it would be more decorated. We have several large Bibles in the collection that are up in the New York State Library's collection. And they're important, especially for genealogists, because we can figure out when people were born, when they died, and when they married. So they are a useful tool. So the next category of artifacts that we have here in the collection are artifacts that were made in the Netherlands and then brought here and associated with a colonial Dutch family. And this Armada chest, which is mid-17th century, came to New York, colonial New York, with the Prine family. Prine family is a prominent Albany County Dutch family, and this Armada chest is basically a safe. It takes 2 people to lift it up and move it, and there is a very complex locking mechanism, so it's hard to get into it. This is not the lock, this is a fake lock, to kind of as a decoy. And then if you look at the iconography on the Armada chest, there are tulips and windmills and ships. Almost everything you think of when you think of the Dutch. A lot of the painting on this Armada chest was probably from the 19th century. A little bit of it is original, but a lot of it has been repainted. And then the last category of artifacts that we have in the collection related to the colonial Dutch are artifacts that were made here after the colonial Dutch settled. So 2 great examples, and this one specifically, these are kasten, which are Dutch cupboards. They are in almost every single 17th century Dutch household. And these are one of the forms that colonial Dutch brought here. So this specific cast was made in the Hudson Valley, and it was part of the Teneyck-Tompkins family collection. And the Teneyck-Tompkins family collection is one of our prominent collections here. It spans 8 generations of families, all Hudson Valley Dutch. The first founder of the Tompkins collection was Andries Teneyck, and he came here in 1749 and landed in, or settled in Queman's Hollow, which is in South Albany County. And he had this cas built in the Hudson Valley. So this was just a cupboard that you would put linens or dishes in, and then you would display your Delft garniture up on top. The cas next to it was made in New York City. You can see it's a very similar form. And this one was probably dated to 1750. And then the last artifact I thought I would share is this Queen Anne style chair, which has some characteristics of Dutch chairs with the turned leg and the balls. But this is a 1750s, 1760s chair, also owned by Andries Teneyck, and it was made in the Hudson Valley. And we can use furniture like this to kind of see how the style from the Netherlands came and was kind of repurposed here in the Hudson Valley. So all of our Dutch artifacts are available for research. Most of them are able to be loaned to other museums. And this little collection only scratches the surface of the Dutch artifacts here in the history collections at the State Museum.